What is up, guys? In this video I'm going to be talking about killer T cells, and I don't really like the naming conventions because we think of like killer T cells and helper T cells as very similar. They are similar in that they both bind to the MHC complex on cells and that they mature in the thymus, but they are very different cell types that are very important in your immune system individually. And so hopefully we are familiar with the typical viral life cycle in which we're going to have some virus floating around in fluid. It's going to latch onto and infect some kind of host cell. So this might be some endothelial cell inside of you when you get the common flu every year. And as this virus moves through its life cycle, it's going to go into the nucleus, degrade a lot of the DNA, make DNA to start making viral proteins, and create a bunch of viral progeny that will eventually burst out and infect even more cells. And by that point, you've got a really bad fever and a cough and a sore throat, and you can't go to work, and now you can't pay rent, and all these other terrible things happen. But that is why we have killer T cells in our immune system. And so killer T cells can be thought of as really great cells to help interrupt the viral life cycle before it gets to this point at which we have the viruses budding off and infecting millions of other cells in your body, because that's when things get really bad and you feel really sick. And so what makes killer T cells so beautiful is that within a normal healthy cell, we have things called MHC proteins, MHC Class I proteins. MHC Class I proteins. And what these MHC Class I proteins are these things on the surface. They're membrane-bound proteins that will display peptides on their surface. And this will be some kind of peptide. And these peptides are basically the cell itself telling or presenting on its surface what it is doing on the inside, because T cells and any cells are really, they can't see what's going on inside necessarily. So what your killer so what normal cells will do is they will take peptides that are making inside their surface. So it's making a lot of these peptides. And if this wasn't an infected cell, it would still be doing the same thing. It's going to put these peptides onto its MHC Class I proteins on its surface, so that T cells, killer T cells that are floating around in solution, have these things called T cell receptors, and it's commonly abbreviated TCR. And they also have things called CD8 receptors. And you'll sometimes see killer T cells abbreviated as CD8 positive cells, or T sub C cells, so cytotoxic cells. And so what they do is that they use their T cell receptor along with this CD8 receptor on the surface of your T killer cell, and it will latch onto and bind to your MHC Class I protein, as well as the peptide that the cell is displaying on its surface. So basically, if I was running a meth lab inside of my house, what I would be doing is that I would be posting pictures on the outside of my house showing police, what am I making on the inside of my house? And you would see that, hey, this guy's not making something that's so great for society, and we should probably shut this down. So basically, think of your killer T cells or CD8 positive cells that are the same thing as the police officers who come by your house and they peer in the windows and they can see that I'm as a cell, is this something I just naturally do all the time? I'm showing you that I make meth inside of my house, so you should come bust in and kill me or something, or hopefully resolve this situation peacefully. But this is the story that goes on inside of your immune system. And so with most healthy cells, they're still going to be displaying the peptides that they make on their surface. And these T cells, when their T cell receptor and their CD8 receptor binds onto the MHC1 and the peptide, is going to identify that this is not necessarily a bad thing. And the question is, how do T killer cells know what's bad? In other words, let's say I live in Portugal or no, not a good example, but let's say I live in an alternate universe in which making meth is perfectly legal and I'm allowed to make meth inside my house. How do the police know that it's okay that I do that and you don't need to bust in my door and disrupt my peaceful lifestyle? Well, it goes back to learning about the life cycle of T cells. And this applies both to T helper cells and the cytotoxic T cells, and that is that every T cell is unique. Every T cell produces a unique T cell receptor. So T cell receptor is unique, and it's trained to identify the bad proteins. So within your thymus, if I was to draw a human body real quick, your thymus is this little organ right here. Sorry. This is your thymus. And within your thymus, you will have a high concentration of healthy proteins that your body is typically making. And these T cell receptors will all be unique for each T cell that is maturing and being trained within your thymus. And so within your thymus, if there are T cell receptors that have affinity for good guy proteins like insulin or phosphofructokinase, or one of these good guy proteins that we expect to find within your cells, then that T cell will be killed. So the thymus is basically training the T cells to identify. The thymus trains these T cells to identify non-self proteins. And so once your thymus has trained your T cells to identify what your non-self proteins are, like the proteins that this virus right here is making, then your T cell will jump into action. It will say, hey, you got to stop making meth inside your house, and it will start secreting these vesicles that will cause the host cell that has been infected to commit apoptosis before it finishes making millions of viral progeny that will go out and infect even more cells in your body. So this is going to wrap up my introduction to killer T cells. The key thing to make note of here is that the killer T cells have the CD8 receptors. They bind onto MHC Class I proteins using their T cell receptor. Based on what peptide is on that MHC Class I protein, they are going to respond appropriately. If it turns out that you're making meth inside of your house, they will bust in, and they're going to basically give you a bunch of vesicles that tell you to go kill yourself, and most of the time this is enough to make the cells commit apoptosis. And these T cells have been trained in the thymus to identify what are good and bad substances that you can be making. And so in the thymus, sticking to my little story, that is where the police officers, the killer T cells, have recognized that meth is an illegal substance that they need to not allow to be made within these cells. So I hope this is useful. Thank you guys for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.